Who invented basketball?
The ball and hoop game was invented by Canadian-American James Naismith, 1861 to 1939, in December 1891. An instructor at the YMCA College. In Springfield, Massachusetts, Naismith was asked by the head of the physical education department to come up with a game to keep students active indoors during the winter months. It had to fit inside the confines of a gym, have no physical contact, use a soft ball, and give everyone who participated a chance to handle the ball. Naismith nailed 2 peach baskets, which he found in the storeroom, to balcony railings at each end of the school's gym. Found a soccer ball, divided his class of 18 men into 2 teams, and introduced the men as it would turn out. The rest of the world to the game, which was later dubbed basketball, 2 words. Improvements to the game came over the next 2 decades as it spread in popularity. In 1910 the important change of allowing ball handlers to move by dribbling was made. In 1916 the rules were changed to allow dribblers to shoot the ball.
What was the impact of the disaster at Chernobyl?
As the worst nuclear power plant disaster to date, the Chernobyl accident in 1986 had far-reaching effects. Total fallout from the accident eventually reached a level 10 times that of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Japan, on August 6, 1945, at the end of World War II, 1939-45. Some 30 firefighters and plant workers died just after the accident. Plants and animals in the immediate area and downwind of the plant were heavily contaminated with radioactive fallout. More than 10 years after the accident, food crops still could not be planted in the region. The immediate after-effects were felt in Europe as well. Some Italian vegetables were found to be contaminated. Reindeer meat in Lapland, a region above the Arctic Circle and extending over northern Norway. Sweden, Finland, and Russia, was declared unfit for human consumption, also due to radioactive contamination. And for a time, fresh meat from Eastern Europe was banned by the EC, European Community. After the accident, some experts predicted disastrous long-term effects, estimating that between 6,500 and 45,000 people could die as a result of cancer caused by exposure to radiation. But a report issued by the World Health Organization, WHO, in 2000 concluded that there is no evidence of a major public health impact attributable to radiation exposure 14 years after the accident. There is no scientific evidence of increases in overall cancer incidence or mortality or in non-malignant disorders that could be related to radiation exposure. Since the type of nuclear power plant, called RMBK, in use in the former Soviet Union is no longer in operation elsewhere in the world, non-Soviet scientists had few lessons to learn from the event. One American nuclear expert remarked that most of the lessons from Chernobyl have been learned already and applied in the United States. However, opinion remained divided over the relative safety of nuclear power in general.
Where does golf sensation Tiger Woods rank among the greats?
Woods, 1975, ranks among the best players of all time. In 1999 he won 8 tournaments, including the Professional Golfers Association, PGA, and Tour Championships, and he was the first player to win 4 consecutive starts since Ben Hogan. 1912 to 1997, in 1953, Hogan won a total of 5 tournaments that year. In 2000 Woods went on to win 9 tournaments, and in 2001 and 2002 he had 5 wins each season, giving him a total of 27 wins in 4 years. In July 2005, with his victory at the British Open, Woods became only the 5th player in golf history to complete a career Grand Slam, winning golf's 4 major tournaments: the Masters, the US Open, the British Open, and the PGA Championship. In 2001 he became the first player to consecutively win the Grand Slam. This impressive run alone assures Woods a place in the annals of golf history. As of mid-2005 Arnold Palmer, 1929, remained the PGA leader for the number of wins in any 4-year period. Between 1960 and 1964 he racked up 29 first-place finishes. He was also the first player to win the Masters 4 times, 1958, 1960, 1962, and 1964. A couple of other legendary names in golf tallied record numbers of wins in short periods to dominate the sport. Ben Hogan won 30 tournaments in 3 seasons, 1946-48, and Byron Nelson, 1912. Won 26 tournaments in just 2 years, 1944 and 1945. Sam Snead, 1912-2002, and Jack Nicklaus, 1940. Dominated the sport over the course of decades. Snead holds the record for the most wins in a career, 81. And Nicklaus follows with 71. At the age of 24 Woods was already the PGA's career earnings leader. To put this in perspective, in 1999 he won $1 million more for the year than golf legend Jack Nicklaus made in his entire PGA Tour career. Woods' ability and appeal combined to help raise earnings overall for the sport. He was credited with expanding golf's horizons by bringing new fans to the game. According to ESPN the magazine, ratings for the final round of each of the 4 majors collectively jumped 56% in 1997 when Woods broke the Masters scoring record. He shot 270 over 72 holes to finish 12 strokes ahead of the second-place winner. At the end of the 2004 season and despite a slump, Woods remained on top for career earnings. But he was followed very closely by Vijay Singh, 1963.
How did the House of Windsor originate?
The origins of Windsor, the family name of the royal house of Great Britain, can be traced to the 1840 marriage of Queen Victoria, who ruled from 1837 to 1901, to her first cousin Albert, the son of the Duke of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, in present-day Germany. As a foreigner, Prince Albert had to overcome the distrust of the British public, which he did by proving himself to be a devoted husband to Queen Victoria and by demonstrating his genuine concern in Britain's national affairs. Victoria and Albert had 9 children. Their oldest son, Albert Edward, 1841 to 1910, became King Edward VII upon Victoria's death in 1901. But Edward's reign lasted only until 1910, when he died and his son, George V, 1865 to 1936, ascended the throne. George was king during World War I, 1914-18, and, in 1917, with Britain and Germany bitter enemies. He denounced his ties and claims to Germany, superseding his grandfather's. Prince Albert's family name of Wettin and establishing the House of Windsor.
What is the classical age?
The classical age refers to the ancient Roman and Greek worlds, roughly 2000 B. C to AD 500. The classical age followed the prehistoric era and preceded the Middle Ages. During this period, the ancient Greeks and Romans made contributions to literature, philosophy, science, the arts, and letters that are still relevant today.
What was the Niagara movement?
It was a short-lived but important African-American organization that advocated the total integration of blacks into mainstream society, with all the rights, privileges, and benefits of other Americans. Founded in Niagara Falls, Ontario, in 1905, the Niagara movement was led by writer, scholar, and activist W.E.B. Du Bois, 1868 to 1963, who was then a professor of economics and history at Atlanta University. Observers described the organization as the anti-Bookerite camp. Educator Booker T. Washington, 1856 to 1915, who rose from slavery to found Alabama's Tuskegee Institute. 1881, believed change for black people should be effected through education and self-improvement, not through demand. Mr. Washington opposed the social and political agitation favored by some reformers. The Niagara movement, on the other hand, placed the responsibility for the nation's racial problems squarely on the shoulders of its white population. The 30 branches of the Niagara movement challenged conservative politics of the so-called Tuskegee machine led by Booker T. Washington. Though the Niagara organization dissolved in 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, was heir to its ideology and activism. Du Bois helped found that organization, and from 1910 to 1934 edited its official journal, The Crisis. in which he published his views on nearly every important social issue that confronted the black community.
What was triangular trade?
Triangular trade refers to the various navigation routes that emerged during the colonial period. There were numerous triangular paths that ships traveled. Ferrying people, goods, both raw and finished, and livestock. The most common triangular route began on Africa's west coast where ships picked up slaves. The second stop was the Caribbean islands, predominantly the British and French West Indies, where the slaves were sold to plantation owners. And traders used the profits to purchase sugar, molasses, tobacco, and coffee. These raw materials were then transported north to the third stop, New England, where a rum industry was thriving. Their ships were loaded with the spirits, and traders made the last leg of their journey back across the Atlantic to Africa's west coast, where the process began again. Other trade routes operated as follows: 1. Manufactured goods were transported from Europe to the African coast. Slaves to the West Indies, and sugar, tobacco, and coffee transported back to Europe, where the triangle began again. 2. Lumber, cotton, and meat were transported from the colonies to southern Europe. Wine and fruits to England, and manufactured goods to the colonies, where the triangle began again. There were as many possible routes as there were ports and demand for goods. The tragic result of triangular trade was the transport of an estimated 10 million black Africans. Sold into slavery, these human beings were often chained below deck and allowed only brief, if any, periods of exercise during the transatlantic crossing, which came to be called the Middle Passage. Conditions for the slaves were brutal and improved only slightly when traders realized that should slaves perish during the long journey across the ocean, it would adversely affect their profits upon arrival in the West Indies. After economies in the islands of the Caribbean crashed at the end of the 1600s, many slaves were sold to plantation owners on the North American mainland, initiating another tragic trade route. The slave trade was abolished in the 1800s, putting an end to the capture of Africans and their forced migration to the Western Hemisphere.
What is privateering?
Privateering is the hiring of privately owned ships and their crews to fight during battle. The practice, dating back to the 1400s, continued well into the 1800s. Eventually replaced by the development of strong navies. Privateers were, essentially, gunboats for hire. They played a crucial role in the American Revolutionary War, 1775–83, after the Second Continental. Congress authorized their use on March 18, 1776, enabling the colonists to capture about 600 British ships. The Americans would again employ privateers in the War of 1812, 1812 to 14. But during times of peace, some privateers turned to pirating, which at least in part prompted European nations to sign the Treaty of Paris of 1856, which ended the Crimean War, 1853 to 56, and outlawed privateering. Since the United States had relied on privateers in the past and had yet to develop its own navy, the Americans did not sign the treaty. While there was some privateering during the American Civil War, 1861 to 65, the need for them soon subsided as navies developed by enlistment and draft. Privateering has not been used in more than 100 years.
What was the immediate impact of television?
The publicity surrounding the World's Fair television broadcast, April 30, 1939, inspired a flurry of broadcasting activity but reached limited audiences. On May 17, the National Broadcasting Company, NBC, televised a baseball game between Princeton University and Columbia University, which NBC billed as the world's first televised sporting event. On August 26, NBC telecast a professional baseball game between the Brooklyn Dodgers and the Cincinnati Reds. More NBC broadcasts from Radio City featured live opera, comedy, and cooking demonstrations. Crowds waiting outside the 1939 New York premiere of Gone with the Wind were also televised. Feature films were aired, including a dramatization of Treasure Island, Young and Beautiful, and the classic silent film The Great Train Robbery, 1903. Soon television stations had proliferated. By May 1940, 23 stations were broadcasting. In 1941, after considerable deliberation on its part and that of the industry itself, the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, adopted transmission standards. Commercial operations were approved effective July 1, and 2 New York stations, National Broadcasting Company, NBC, and Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, affiliates, went on the air. By the end of that year, the first commercial on television, financed by watch manufacturer Bulova, was aired. In December, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the entrance of the United States into World War II, 1939 to 45, commercial development of television was put on hold while American industry devoted its resources to the war effort. But the television industry was eager, and as soon as Allied victory looked like a sure thing, Radio Corporation of American, RCA, reopened its NBC television studio on April 10, 1944. CBS followed suit, reopening its operations on May 5. At the war's end in 1945, 9 part-time and partly commercial television stations were on the air, reaching about 7,500 set owners in the New York, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Schenectady, New York. By 1947, the 4 networks that then existed, ABC, CBS, NBC, and Dumont, a short-lived competitor, could still provide only about 10 hours of prime-time programming a week, much of it sporting events. In late 1948 it was estimated that only 10% of the population had even seen a television show. However, as the networks stepped up their programming with live drama programs, children's shows, and variety shows, a format that was familiar and popular to the American radio listening audience, interest in television grew rapidly. By the spring of 1948, industry experts estimated that 150,000 sets were in public places such as bars and pubs, accounting for about half of the total number of sets in operation. Just a year later, 940,000 homes had televisions. And by 1949 production of sets had jumped to 3 million.
What was Plato's relationship to Socrates and Aristotle?
The Athens-born Plato, originally, Aristocles, was Socrates' disciple and Aristotle's teacher. The philosophies of these three men combined to lay the foundations of Western thought. With the death sentence of his spiritual guide, Socrates, in 399 BC, Plato's c. 428 to 347 BC, dissatisfaction with the Athenian government reached its peak. Traveling throughout the Mediterranean after the death of Socrates, Plato returned to Athens in 387 BC, and 1 mile outside of the city he established the Academy, a school of philosophy supported entirely by philanthropists. Students paid no fees. One of the pupils there was young Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, who remained at the Academy for 20 years before venturing out on his own. Plato wrote a series of dialogues in which Socrates figures prominently. The most highly regarded of these is the Republic, in which Plato discusses justice and the ideal state. It was his belief that people would not be able to eliminate injustice from society until rulers became philosophers. Until all philosophers are kings, or the kings and princes of this world have the spirit and power of philosophy, and political greatness and wisdom meet in one. And those commoner natures who pursue either to the exclusion of the other are compelled to stand aside. Cities will never have rest from their evils, no, nor the human race. Also on the subject of the ideal state, Plato wrote but did not finish Laws. His other works include Symposium, which considers ideal love, Phaedrus, which attacks the prevailing notions about rhetoric, Apology, which is a rendering of the speech Socrates delivered at his own trial in 399 BC, and Phaedo, which discusses the immortality of the soul and which is supposed to be a record of Socrates' last conversation before he drank hemlock and died.
What is the social contract?
The The social contract is the concept that human beings have made a deal with their government. And within the context of that agreement, both the government and the people have distinct roles. The theory is based on the idea that humans abandoned a natural, free and ungoverned state in favor of a society that provides them with order, structure, and, very importantly, protection. Through the ages, many philosophers have considered the role of both the government and its citizens within the context of the social contract. In the theories of English philosopher John Locke, 1632–1704, the social contract was inextricably tied to natural law, the theory that some laws are fundamental to human nature. Locke argued that people first lived in a state of nature, where they had no restrictions on their freedom. Realizing that conflict arose as each individual defended his or her own rights, the people agreed to live under a common government, which offers them protection. But in doing so they had not abandoned their natural rights. On the contrary, argued Locke, the government should protect the rights of the people, particularly the rights of life, liberty, and property. Locke put these ideas into print, publishing his two most influential works in 1690. Essay Concerning Human Understanding and two treatises of government. These works firmly established him as the leading philosopher of freedom. His writings profoundly influenced Thomas Jefferson, 1743–1826. Author of the Declaration of Independence, 1776, which asserts that there are self-evident truths, natural laws, that people are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, natural rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712–1778, one of the great figures of the Enlightenment. A cultural period of the 17th and 18th centuries, during which reason was celebrated as a superior human virtue, later published a book on the subject of the social contract. In his book titled Social Contract, 1762, he wrote that people enter into a binding agreement among themselves, and it is incumbent upon them to establish their government and government systems. According to Rousseau, people have a duty to obey only legitimate powers, meaning that only the people can decide who governs them. Rousseau's ideas helped promote the causes of the French Revolution, 1789–99, and the American Revolution, 1775–83. The concept of the social contract as defined by Rousseau materialized in the Declaration of Independence, 1776, which proclaims that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. The well-known words of the American's Creed, written in 1917 by William Tyler Page, 1868–1942, of Maryland, also asserts these principles: I believe in the United States of America as a government of the people, by the people, for the people, whose just powers are derived from the consent of the governed.
What are the hallmarks of classical Greek civilization?
Among the great Greek philosophers are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Greek literature includes the epic poetry of Homer as well as the passionate love poems of Sappho. The Greeks gave humankind the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, which continue to be studied by students today, along with the comedies of Aristophanes and Menander. The classical Greeks loved to speak, and oratory is considered by some to be their highest form of prose. Orators known to the modern world are Antiphon, Lysias, Isocrates, and Demosthenes. Herodotus, called the father of history, left the modern world with an account of the Persian Wars. 500 to 449 BC, a conflict between the Greek city-states and the Persian Empire. The Greeks also gave humankind the father of medicine in physician Hippocrates, who taught that doctors should use reason to determine the cause of illness and should study the patient's appearance, behavior, and lifestyle to diagnose and treat. The Hippocratic Oath, versions of which are still sworn by medical students graduating today, is attributed to Hippocrates. Greek scientists include Thales and Pythagoras, scientist philosophers include Leucippus and Democritus. And of course, the Greeks gave modern culture the Olympic Games.
Why is Jane Austen widely read today?
Austen is considered one of the greatest novelists in English. She wrote just 6 books during her lifetime, including her best-known works Sense and Sensibility. Published 1811, Pride and Prejudice, 1813, and Emma, 1816. But in so doing she created the novel of manners, which continues to delight readers today. The daughter of a clergyman, Jane Austen, 1775 to 1817, rejected the literary movement of the day. Romanticism, opting instead to portray life as she knew it. As such, she was the first realist in the English novel. Austen's works are ripe with shrewd observation, wit, and an appreciation for the charms of everyday life, making her an engaging storyteller for all time.
Who was Emmett Till?
Emmett Till, 1941 to 1955, was a black 14-year-old from Chicago who was brutally mutilated and killed in the Deep South in August 1955. The young man was visiting relatives in Mississippi when he allegedly whistled at a white female store clerk. Till was sharing a bed with his 12-year-old cousin when 2 white men came to get him on the morning of August 28. He was not seen alive again. His body was later found in a river, tied to a cotton gin fan with barbed wire. An all-white jury acquitted the store clerk's husband, Roy Bryant, and half-brother, J.W. Millman, of the crime. The events stirred anger in the black community and among civil rights proponents in general, setting off the civil rights movement. For 4 decades, Till's grisly murder continued to deeply trouble many who believed justice could still be served. Though no one was ever convicted of the crime, and the 2 men who were tried for it had, by 2005, died, some of Till's family and friends, as well as investigators, believed others who participated in the lynching might still be alive. In a quest for clues, Till's body was disinterred in June 2005 to gather evidence. He was reburied in a quiet funeral. The Till family hoped the pending investigation would yield answers and justice.
What is the Mycenaean age?
The Dorians, aided by the superiority of the Iron Sword, flooded southward, where they sacked and burned the great Mycenaean cities and conquered the wealthy sea traders, throwing Greece into the period known as the Dark Ages, or Archaic period, which lasted from 1100 to about 800 B.C.
Why was the invention of the reaper important to the U.S. economy?
Reapers, machines developed in the early 1800s to help farmers harvest grain such as wheat, dramatically increased overall grain production and consumption in the United States and the rest of the world. The first commercially successful reaper was built in 1831 by Virginia-born inventor Cyrus Hall McCormick. 1809 to 1884, who patented it in 1834 and first sold it in 1840 in Virginia. The McCormick reaper was horse-drawn and replaced the use of sickles and scythes in the fields. It also reduced the amount of manual labor required to harvest grain crops. It worked in this way: a straight blade, protected by guards, was linked to a drive wheel. As the drive wheel turned, the blade moved back and forth in a sawing motion, cutting through the stalks of grain, which were held straight by rods. The cut grain stalks then fell onto a platform and were collected with a rake by a worker. The device increased average production from 2 or 3 acres a day to 10 acres a day. McCormick's reaper was soon in wide use, and the inventor was on his way to becoming an industrialist. In 1847 he moved his business to Chicago, where he could transport reapers via the Great Lakes and connected waterways to the east and to the south. Within 5 years McCormick's business had become the largest farm implement factory in the world. Sales and distribution of the equipment increased further during the 1850s. As Chicago became a center for the nation's then expanding rail system. In 1879 Cyrus McCormick's business became the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company. With the inventor himself as president, until 1884, when he was succeeded by his son. The reaper was improved over time. In the 1850s a self-raking feature was added, further reducing the amount of labor required to harvest grain. In the 1870s a binder was added, which bound the sheaves of grain and dropped them to the ground to be collected. In the 1920s the reaper, or harvester, was joined with another invention, the thresher, which separates grains from the stalks. The new reaper thresher machine was called a combine. Today's combines still use the basic features present in McCormick's revolutionary 1831 invention. His company later became International Harvester, 1902, and today is known as Navy Star Corporation.
What is the Ark of the Covenant?
According to Judeo-Christian tradition, the Ark of the Covenant is a decorative box that holds the tablets containing the Ten Commandments, also called the Law. The Ark was constructed by skilled craftsmen in Sinai. It was made exactly to God's specifications, which are first mentioned in the Bible in Exodus 25:10-22. The Israelites carried the ark with them into the Promised Land, where King Solomon, 10th century BC, built a permanent temple to house it. When the Babylonians captured Jerusalem in 586 BC, the ark was either destroyed or taken. If it survived, its location is a mystery that has intrigued scholars and archaeologists, as well as popular culture. However, some scholars believe the ark never really existed.
What were the rights of man?
In 1789 the French Assembly made the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, meant to flesh out the revolutionary cry of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Influenced by the U.S. Declaration of Independence, 1776, as well as the ideas of the Enlightenment. The document guaranteed religious freedom, the freedom of speech and the press, and personal security. It proclaimed that man has natural and inalienable rights, which include liberty, property, personal security, and resistance to oppression. The Declaration further stipulated that no one may be accused, imprisoned, or held under arrest except in such cases and in such a way as is prescribed by law, and that every man is presumed innocent until he is proved guilty. The Declaration was subsequently written into the preamble of the French Constitution, 1791. However, the Code Napoleon superseded many of the ideas it set forth.
Who were the Wobblies?
The Wobblies were the early radical members of the Industrial Workers of the World. IWW, a union founded in 1905 by the leaders of 43 labor organizations. the group pursued short-term goals via strikes and acts of sabotage as well as the long-term goal of overthrowing capitalism and rebuilding society based on socialist principles. One IWW organizer proclaimed that the final aim is revolution. Their extremist views and tactics attracted national attention, making IWW and Wobblies household terms during the early decades of the 20th century. Founded and led by miner and socialist William Big Bill Haywood. 1869 to 1928, and mine workers agitator Mary Mother Jones, 1830 to 1930, the IWW aimed to unite all workers in a camp, mine, or factory for the eventual takeover of the industrial facility. The Union organized strikes in lumber and mining camps in the West. In the steel mills of Pennsylvania, and in the textile mills of New England. The leadership advocated the use of violence to achieve its revolutionary goals and opposed mediation. Negotiations moderated by a neutral third party, collective bargaining. Bargaining between worker representatives and an employer, and arbitration, third-party mediation. The group declined during World War I, 1914-18. When the IWW led strikes that were suppressed by the federal government. The organization's leaders were arrested and the organization weakened. Haywood was convicted of sedition, inciting resistance to lawful authority, but managed to escape the country. He died in the Soviet Union, where he was given a hero's burial for his socialist views. The IWW never rose again to the prominent status of its early, controversial days. Many accounts of the group's history cite its demise in the 1920s. But, according to its own statement, the organization continued to enjoy a more or less continuous existence into the 21st century. As the IWW prepared to celebrate its 100th anniversary in 2005, it continued to promote its original goal of organizing workers by industry rather than trade. Under the IWW's scheme, workers around the world would organize into one big union divided into 6 camps or departments: agriculture and fisheries, mining and minerals, general construction, manufacture and general production, transportation and communication, and public service. In the early 2000s, the IWW had a few dozen member unions in the United States, as well as branches in Australia, Japan, Canada, and the British Isles.
What happened at Anzio?
Anzio, Italy, was the site of a 4-month battle between Allied troops and the Germans during World War II, 1939-45. On January 22, 1944, more than 36,000 Allied troops and thousands of vehicles made an amphibious landing at Anzio, which is situated on a peninsula jutting into the Tyrrhenian Sea. But German soldiers, led by Field Marshal Albert Kesserling, 1885-1960, were able to surround the Allied forces, containing them along the shoreline into May of that year. Fighting was intense, with an estimated 60,000 casualties, about half on each side. On May 25, 1944, the Germans withdrew in defeat, enabling the Allies to march toward Rome, 33 miles to the north-northwest. The taking of Anzio was a tactical surprise on the part of the US and British, and their eventual victory there was a turning point for the Allies in the war.
What was the Bataan Death March?
It was one of the most brutal chapters of World War II, 1939–45. On April 9, 1942, American forces on the Bataan Peninsula, Philippines, surrendered to the Japanese. More than 75,000 American and Filipino troops became prisoners of war, POWs. On April 10, they were forced to begin a 65-mile march to a POW camp. Conditions were torturous: high temperatures, meager provisions, and gross maltreatment. The troops were denied food and water for days at a time, they were not allowed to rest in the shade. They were indiscriminately beaten, and those who fell behind were killed. On stretches where some troops were transported by train, the boxcars were packed so tightly that many POWs died of suffocation. The forced march lasted more than a week. 20,000 men died along the way. But the end of the march was not the end of the horrors for the surviving POWs. About 56,000 men were held until the end of the war. They endured starvation, torture, and horrific cruelties. Some were forced to work as slave laborers in Japanese industrial plants, and some became subjects of medical experiments. In August 1945 their POW camp was liberated by the Allied forces, and the surviving troops were put on U.S. Navy vessels for the trip home, as part of the United States' 1951 peace treaty with Japan. Surviving POWs were barred from seeking reparations from Japanese firms that had benefited from their slave labor. This injustice continued to be the subject of proposed congressional legislation into the early 2000s. With no positive outcome for the veterans as of 2005.
What advances were made in medicine during the Middle Ages?
During the Middle Ages, 500–1350, medicine became institutionalized. The first public hospitals were opened and the first formal medical schools were established, making healthcare formerly administered only in the home, more widely available and improving the training of doctors. These developments had been brought on by necessity. Europe saw successive waves of epidemics during the Middle Ages. Outbreaks of leprosy began in the 500s and peaked in the 1200s, the Black Death. The bubonic plague killed about a quarter of the European population. And smallpox and other diseases afflicted hundreds of thousands of people. Consequently, many hospitals meant to serve the poor were established. As were the first medical schools, some of them associated with universities that were then forming, such as the University of Bologna, Italy, and the University of Paris, France. In 900 the first medical school was started in Salerno, Italy. European physicians during the period were greatly influenced by the works of Persian physician and philosopher Rhazes. Or Rhazes, c. 865 c. 930. Considered the greatest doctor of the Islamic world. Rhazes's works accurately describing measles and smallpox were translated into Latin and became seminal references in the Christian world as well. Another prominent Islamic, the scientist Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, 980-1037, produced a philosophical scientific encyclopedia, which included the medical knowledge of the time. In the West, the work became known as Canon of Medicine and with its descriptions of many diseases, including tetanus and meningitis, it remained influential in European medical education for the next 600 years.
What is Zionism?
Zionism was founded as the nationalist movement to establish an independent Jewish state. It began in the 1890s, and roughly 50 years later, in 1948. The movement's activism resulted in the proclamation of the State of Israel. Since that time, Zionism has focused its efforts on building bridges between Israel and Jewish people around the world. The roots of Zionism date to 1882, when a movement began encouraging Jewish settlement of Palestine. The region in the Middle East, in Southwest Asia, that borders the Mediterranean Sea to the west, Lebanon to the north, Syria and Jordan to the east, and Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, to the southwest. Groups advocating immigration to the Jewish homeland in Palestine called themselves Lovers of Zion. Hovevei Zion. Mount Zion is the site in Jerusalem where the Temple of David, king of the ancient Hebrews, d. 962 BC, was built, and it is therefore considered the center of Jewish spiritual life. As a political movement, Zionism was founded in the late 1890s by Austrian journalist Theodor Herzl, 1860 to 1904. In 1894 Herzl was among the reporters covering the trial of Alfred Dreyfus, a French army officer falsely convicted of treason. Though the artillery captain, who was Jewish, was later declared innocent. The guilty verdict rendered in his first trial was annulled. Many felt the Dreyfus case had exposed a deep vein of anti-Semitism in Europe. Herzl's conclusion was that if anti-Semitism could take hold in France, it could prevail anywhere. Based on this belief, he began working for the reclamation of a Jewish state in the Middle East. In 1897 Herzl convened the First Zionist Congress, held in Basel, Switzerland, bringing the movement to worldwide attention. In 1917, against the backdrop of World War I, 1914-18, British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour 1848 to 1930, issued a declaration vowing his country's support for a national Jewish homeland in Palestine. This came after British troops liberated the Middle East from the control of the Ottoman Empire. In 1920 the Ottoman Empire dissolved as part of the conclusion of World War I, and by international agreement the British were given rule over Palestine. Numerous Jews immigrated to Palestine, where fighting broke out with Arabs who opposed Jewish resettlement. Previously boosted by British support of an independent Jewish state, Zionists received a heavy blow in 1937 when, with another conflict in Europe on the horizon, Britain reversed its policy in Palestine in an effort to gain Arab support should fighting break out with Germany. At the end of World War II, 1939-45, Britain turned over the problem in the Middle East to the newly created United Nations, which decided that out of Palestine, both an independent Jewish state and a self-ruling Arab state should be formed. In 1948 the State of Israel was declared by Polish-born and Zionist moderate David Ben-Gurion. 1886 to 1973, who became head of the nation's provisional government. The World Zionist Congress was later separated from the government. The organization has since turned its attention to immigration and cultural activities. German-born scientist Albert Einstein, 1897 to 1955, was among Zionism's most prominent adherents.
How did World War II begin?
The war began on September 1, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, which was soon crushed by German Chancellor and Führer Adolf Hitler's, 1889 to 1945, war machine. But while the Nazis moved in from the west, Poland was under attack by the Soviets from the north and east. The events in the Eastern European country had set the stage for a major conflict. After Poland, the Germans moved into Denmark, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, and France, taking control as they went. By June 1940 only Great Britain stood against Hitler, who was joined by Axis power Italy. Before long, fighting had spread into Greece and northern Africa. In June 1941 Germany invaded the Soviet Union, enlarging the scope of the conflict again. With the world's focus on war-torn Europe, Japan executed a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in December 1941, which drew Americans into the war. The war would not end until 1945.
When was the radio invented?
The radio, or wireless, was born in 1895 when Italian physicist and inventor Guglielmo Marconi, 1874 to 1937, experimented with wireless telegraphy. The following year he transmitted telegraph signals, through the air, from Italy to England. By 1897 Marconi founded his own company, Marconi's Wireless Telegraph Company, Ltd. in London and began setting up communication lines across the English Channel to France, which he accomplished in 1898. In 1900 Marconi established the American Marconi Company. He continued making improvements, including those that allowed for sending out signals on different wavelengths so that multiple messages could be transmitted at one time, without interfering with each other. The first transatlantic message, from Cornwall, England, to Newfoundland, Canada, was sent and received in 1901. At first radio technology was regarded as a novelty and few understood how it could work. But in January 1901 a Marconi wireless station at South Wellfleet, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod, received Morse code messages as well as faint music and voices from Europe. That event changed the perception of radio. Before long, Americans had become accustomed to receiving radiograms, messages transmitted via the wireless. In 1906 the first radio broadcast of voice and music was made. The event originated at Brant Rock, Massachusetts, on Christmas Eve, and the program was picked up by ships within a radius of several hundred miles. That accomplishment resulted from the invention of another radio pioneer, American engineer Reginald Fessenden. 1866 to 1932, who patented a high-frequency alternator. 1901, capable of generating continuous waves rather than intermittent impulses, it was the first successful radio transmitter. In 1910 American inventor Lee De Forest, 1873 to 1961, the father of radio. Broadcast opera singer Enrico Caruso's, 1873 to 1921, tenor voice over the airwaves. In 1916 De Forest transmitted the first radio news broadcast. Westinghouse station KDKA in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was the first corporately sponsored station, and the first broadcast station licensed on a frequency outside amateur bands. Within 3 years of its first commercial radio broadcast, which announced the election returns in the presidential race on November 2, 1920, Warren G. Harding won. There were more than 500 radio stations in the United States.
Did Aristotle develop his own philosophy?
A student of Plato's for 20 years, Aristotle's ideas were unquestionably influenced by his teacher. However, Aristotle developed his own doctrine, which he applied to many subjects. Aristotle rejected Plato's theory of forms, or theory of ideas. While Aristotle, too, believed in material, the physical being, and forms, the unchanging truths. Unlike his teacher, he believed that it is the concrete, material, that has substantial being. Aristotle viewed the basic task of philosophy as explaining why and how things are, or how they become what they are. It is for this reason that Aristotle had not only a profound and lasting influence on philosophy but on scientific spirit.
What happened after the 1993 World Trade Center bombing?
During the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, investigation that followed the February 26, 1993, tragedy, it was learned that the World Trade Center was one of several intended targets of an Islamic extremist group. The bomb explosion in Lower Manhattan killed 6 people and started a fire that sent black smoke through the 110-story Twin Towers, injuring hundreds and forcing 100,000 people to evacuate the premises. Days later, on March 4, 25-year-old Mohammed A. Salameh, an illegal Jordanian immigrant, was arrested in Jersey City, New Jersey. Salameh was later found to be a follower of self-exiled Islamic fundamentalist leader Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman. 1933, who was wanted by Egypt for having incited anti-government riots in 1989. In June, investigators seized Arab terrorists they accused of plotting to blow up several New York City sites, including the United Nations headquarters and the Holland and Lincoln tunnels. U.S. authorities then arrested Rahman and imprisoned him on suspicion of complicity in the World Trade Center bombing. On October 1, 1995, a federal jury found Rahman and 9 other militant Muslims guilty of conspiring to carry out a campaign of terrorist bombings and assassinations aimed at forcing Washington to abandon its support of Israel and Egypt. The 1993 bombing foreshadowed the terrorist strikes of September 11, 2001. Which destroyed the landmark Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan and launched what came to be called a global war on terrorism.
Were any 9/11's conspirators convicted?
Yes, but by 2005 there had been only one. French citizen Zacharias Moussaoui, 1968, was convicted in a U.S. court in Alexandria, Virginia, in connection with the September 11, 2001, attacks that claimed nearly 3,000 lives. Moussaoui was taken into custody by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. In August 2001, a flight instructor in Minnesota, where he was training, had reported him as suspicious. After the September terrorist attacks, Moussaoui continued to be held as the possible 20th hijacker. One of the flights on September 11 had 4 hijackers, the other 3 flights each had 5. For the next 3 years, the suspected terrorist was the subject of a sometimes dramatic legal battle. Moussaoui insulted the U.S. district judge hearing his case, attempted to fire his lawyers, and pleaded guilty only to later change his mind. On April 22, 2005, the case came to close when Moussaoui admitted his guilt in front of a packed courtroom. His sentencing trial was set for 2006.
Who wrote the Quran?
The Quran, or Quran, contains the holy scriptures of Islam, and was written by the followers of the Prophet Muhammad, c. 570 to 632. It is not known whether these texts were written down during Muhammad's lifetime or after his death. It is known that the texts were codified, organized into a body, between 644 and 656. Muslims believe the angel Gabriel revealed the book to Muhammad, beginning in 610 and continuing until the Prophet's death in 632. The Quran. Meaning recitation, consists of 114 verses, ayahs, that are organized in chapters, surahs. Muslims believe the beautiful prose of the Quran to be the words of God Himself, who spoke through Muhammad. Further, it is believed to be only a copy of an eternal book, which is kept by Allah. The Quran is also held up by Muslims as proof that Muhammad was indeed a prophet, since no human is capable of composing such text. Among the most widely read texts today, the Quran is also taught orally, so that even Muslims who are illiterate may know and be able to recite verses.
Who was Tokyo Rose?
Wartime radio broadcasts by a woman called Tokyo Rose were an Axis propaganda effort intended to weaken the resolve of American and Allied troops. The Japanese pressed into service Allied POWs and a woman named Eva Toguri d'Aquino, a U.S. citizen caught in wartime Japan, to read over the radio what were intended to be demoralizing messages to the Allied troops. Originating in Japan and heard by soldiers and sailors in the Pacific, the broadcasts were either disregarded by their intended audience or were found mildly amusing. Though d'Aquino was later convicted of treason. In 1977, President Gerald Ford issued an unconditional pardon in the case, which was built on tainted facts. The Axis powers did the same sort of broadcasts from Germany, where Axis Sally aired messages that were heard throughout Europe.